Imagine being dragged through the marble gates of Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, a world where whispers could kill and beauty was both a blessing and a curse. You are young, strong, and enslaved. And tonight, you do not know if you will survive until morning. Because within the golden walls of the Ottoman court, the male concubines of the Sultan endured horrors so grotesque, so secret, that history tried to bury them forever. From castrations carried out by dull knives, to forbidden rituals that blurred the lines between pain, pleasure, and power, these young men were not lovers, nor servants. They were prisoners of lust, trapped in a nightmare dressed in silk. And the shocking truth? These practices were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were rituals of control, enforced by one of the most powerful empires in the world. Tonight, we will uncover the 10 most horrifying sexual practices forced upon male slaves in the Ottoman Empire, and once you hear them, you'll never look at history's golden palaces the same way again. But before we begin, welcome to Royal Conspiracies, the channel where we pull back the velvet curtains of history to expose the darkest secrets of kings, queens, and empires. If you love shocking history that schools never dared to teach, subscribe now, hit the like button, and share this video, because what you're about to hear is not just disturbing, it's unforgettable. The year is 1570. Across the shores of the Mediterranean, fear had a name: the Ottoman slave hunters. From the bustling ports of Venice, to the villages of the Balkans, to the deserts of Sudan, young boys were the empire's most coveted prize. They came in chains. Some were captured in raids, ripped from their mothers' arms as soldiers torched their villages. Others were sold by desperate families into slavery, tricked with promises of wealth and safety. Many were prisoners of war, marched for miles under the burning sun until their bare feet bled. By the time they reached Istanbul, they were no longer children of their homeland. They were merchandise. At the heart of the empire stood the infamous slave markets of Constantinople. Here, under the marble arches and echoing halls, men with sharp eyes inspected every captive like cattle. The buyers were no ordinary men. They were eunuchs, agents of the palace, trained to search for beauty, youth, and submission. A boy's skin was touched, his muscles prodded, his teeth inspected as though he were a horse. Any sign of defiance, a glare, a clenched jaw, even a tear, could mark him for punishment. And then came the humiliation. The captives were stripped completely bare. In front of strangers, their bodies were examined for flaws. Scars, crooked bones, even the shape of their lips could decide their fate. The more delicate, the more innocent, the more feminine in beauty, the more likely they were chosen for the Sultan's inner palace. The others? Sold off to serve in fields, ships, or construction. But those chosen, they were destined for something far darker. Once purchased, the boys were marched through the labyrinthine streets of Istanbul. The city bustled with merchants, spices, and prayer calls, but the captives noticed none of it. Their eyes were fixed on the rising silhouette of the Topkapi Palace, the golden crown of the Ottoman world. To outsiders, Topkapi was a place of splendor, gilded domes, gardens filled with roses, fountains that sparkled like crystal. But to the captives, it was a fortress of silence, its high walls hiding screams no one outside would ever hear. Upon entering, the boys were led into a chamber known only as the Selection Hall. Here, under candlelight, they were once again displayed before officials of the harem. Every detail was recorded: age, origin, physical beauty. The youngest, sometimes barely 10 or 12, were seen as malleable clay, easier to break, easier to train, easier to own. Some begged for mercy in broken Turkish, others remained silent in terror. It made no difference. Their lives no longer belonged to them. From this moment, they were stripped not only of their clothes, but of their names. The palace gave them new ones: foreign, exotic, chosen to please the tongue of the Sultan. Their pasts, their identities, their families, all erased with a single stroke of ink on a register. And then came the whispers, the rumors that spread among the captives. Some spoke of eunuchs, tall men in black robes, who ruled the palace's hidden corridors. Others spoke of castration, of boys who screamed for days before dying on the cold stone floors. And some whispered of nights when the Sultan himself descended into the chambers, choosing slaves like one might choose fruit at a market. The captives did not yet know which fate awaited them. But as the gates closed behind them, one truth was clear: they had entered a world from which there was no return. The nightmare had only just begun. For the young captives inside the Topkapi Palace, whispers of a single word filled them with terror: castration. The boys didn't fully understand at first. They saw the eunuchs, the tall, black-robed guards who moved silently through the corridors, their voices calm, their eyes cold. The eunuchs commanded fear and respect, for they held the keys to the harem's deepest chambers. They seemed different, distant, almost inhuman. And slowly the new captives learned why. These men had been through the same ritual. Their manhood stolen, their bodies mutilated, their futures carved away with a knife. For the Ottoman court, castration was not merely punishment, it was policy. Male slaves who were destined for the Sultan's harems could not be allowed to desire women, nor threaten the bloodline of the royal family. The harem was the Sultan's sacred domain, and no seed but his own could be sown. And so, the ritual began. The process was shrouded in secrecy, hidden behind locked doors, away from the public eye. Few outside the palace ever saw it, and those who did rarely survived long enough to speak of it. But records, fragments of diaries, and the chilling accounts of European travelers reveal enough to piece together the nightmare. The boys were led into a stone chamber, often damp and dimly lit by a single oil lamp. The air was thick with the smell of iron, blood and rust mingled together. Here, the palace physicians, often men from foreign lands, prepared their tools: knives not sharp enough for mercy, clamps, and bowls of scalding oil. The boys were stripped naked, trembling in silence. Some screamed prayers, some fainted, others begged with eyes wide in terror. But their voices meant nothing. To the empire, they were not humans, they were property. The cut was quick, but the suffering was endless. With little knowledge of true surgical methods, the crude operation often ended in blood loss, infection, or death. Some were castrated fully, both penis and testicles removed. Others, only the testicles, leaving behind twisted scars that forever reminded them of what was stolen. The pain was unimaginable. Without anesthesia, the victims writhed and thrashed, often restrained by ropes or held down by other slaves. The screams echoed through the chambers, seeping into the walls of Topkapi itself. Once the mutilation was done, hot oil or burning cloths were pressed against the wounds to stop the bleeding. Many did not survive the night. Their bodies were carried out before dawn, buried in silence, never recorded by name. But those who lived became eunuchs. To the Ottomans, this was not cruelty, it was order. Eunuchs could be trusted to guard the women of the harem, to serve the Sultan loyally, and to manage the palace's most intimate secrets. Their suffering became their badge, their mutilation their key to power. And so, in a twisted way, some survivors even rose high. The chief black eunuch, known as the Kisler Agassi, became one of the most powerful men in the empire, controlling not only the Sultan's harem but also vast political networks. He could decide the fate of concubines, princes, and even viziers. But beneath his silken robes and golden chains, his body bore the same scars as the lowest slave. For the young captives, castration was not a choice. It was their initiation into a world of humiliation. Each survivor carried more than just a physical wound. They carried the knowledge that they would never be men in the way their fathers once were. No wives, no children, no legacy, only service until death released them. And yet, this was only the beginning, because once the body was broken, the soul was next. As the captives healed, if they healed, they were forced into the next phase of their new lives: sexual initiation. Nights of terror awaited, where the Sultan and his court tested their obedience in ways too dark for daylight. And in those chambers, silence was never protection. For the Sultan's desire was law, and his slaves had no escape. The wounds of castration had barely healed when the boys learned the next horror awaiting them: initiation. For most, it began without warning. One night, a eunuch would appear at their chamber door, silent and expressionless. He would gesture, and the boy, still weak, still afraid, was forced to follow. through winding halls lit by torchlight, deeper and deeper into the belly of Topkapi, until they reached a chamber known only to a few, the Sultan's private apartments. Here, the true test began. Inside these velvet-draped rooms, time seemed to stop. The walls were decorated with silks, gold, and paintings brought from faraway lands, but for the slaves, the beauty meant nothing. It was the silence, the suffocating silence, that crushed them. The Sultan, often surrounded by his favorites and shadowy advisors, did not see them as people. He saw them as objects of entertainment, bodies to mold, tools for his pleasure. The young concubines were ordered to bathe in scented waters, rubbed with oils until their skin glistened under the dim lamps. Their nakedness was no longer their own. It belonged to the empire's ruler. The initiation was not gentle. It was the breaking of the spirit. Some boys were forced to dance, their bodies trembling as musicians played slow, haunting notes on the ney flute. The dances were not for art. They were for humiliation. Every sway of the hip, every glance downward was meant to strip them of dignity, to turn them from captives into submissives. Others were commanded to perform acts they did not understand, pushed into situations designed to erase innocence forever. Resistance was met with swift cruelty, whips across the back, burning incense pressed to the skin, or days locked in dark cells without food or water. The Sultan himself was unpredictable. At times he watched in silence, his gaze sharp and unreadable. At other times he joined in, demanding the boys prove their loyalty through acts that no child should endure. And always, there was an audience, eunuchs who recorded everything, making sure no secret left the chamber walls. For the boys, the terror was not only in the acts themselves, but in the uncertainty. They never knew if the night would end with their release back to their sleeping mats, or with their bodies dumped into the Bosphorus, never to be seen again. Those who survived the first initiation were marked forever. They were no longer newcomers. They were now palace property, tested and broken, ready for whatever else the empire demanded. But the scars ran deep. Many became shadows of themselves, speaking little, their eyes hollow. Some wept silently into their pillows, their tears staining the thin linen sheets. Others hardened, numbing themselves to the pain, determined to survive at any cost, even if it meant betraying their fellow slaves. And yet, in this darkness, a twisted hierarchy emerged. Those who submitted most willingly, who pleased the Sultan without hesitation, were sometimes rewarded with fine clothes, better food, or a position closer to power. For some, this survival tactic became a weapon. They learned to perform, to smile, to hide their disgust behind painted obedience. But deep inside, every laugh, every gesture, was another chain tightening around their soul. And then, there were the rumors. Whispers of nights when the Sultan invited foreign guests, foreign princes, or his most trusted viziers into the chamber, forcing the boys to perform in front of strangers. These whispered stories, passed from slave to slave, carried no proof, yet they painted a picture more horrifying than anything written in official history. Because what happened in those rooms was never written down. It lived only in screams that echoed through stone walls, and in the broken bodies that emerged at dawn. The palace called this training. The boys knew it as nightmares made flesh. For the young concubines, survival meant enduring, no matter the humiliation, no matter the pain. But with each passing night, their fear grew sharper. Because they realized something far more terrifying than death itself. The Sultan's desire had no limits. And the games had only just begun. There was a room in Topkapi Palace that the concubines spoke of only in whispers. They called it the Chamber of Silence. It was not part of the grand palace tours shown to visiting dignitaries. It was buried deep in the inner walls, its doors guarded by eunuchs who never spoke. No sound escaped from within, no music, no voices, not even screams. For here, silence was enforced by fear. Inside, the Sultan's most disturbing rituals unfolded. Male slaves were gathered together, stripped of individuality, forced to perform not for themselves, but for the twisted entertainment of their master. The chamber was designed with cruel precision. Thick carpets absorbed the sounds of struggle. The walls were layered with tapestries, not for beauty, but to smother the echo of cries. Even the smallest breath seemed to vanish into the air. Here, the concubines were ordered to act out fantasies, to dance, to fight, to touch, to humiliate one another while the Sultan and his inner circle watched from behind screens. Refusal was impossible. Disobedience meant torture, and sometimes, execution. The chamber lived up to its name. Not because it was truly silent, but because the boys learned to silence themselves. They swallowed their screams. They hid their sobs. Their eyes spoke the pain their mouths could not. And when it was over, they were led back into the corridors, their faces blank, their lips sealed. No one dared speak of what they had endured. To speak was to die. The Chamber of Silence became a tomb for secrets, secrets buried alive within the souls of the slaves who entered it. Inside the Sultan's palace, fear alone was not enough to control the slaves. The rulers knew a darker weapon, jealousy. The male concubines were constantly compared, measured, and judged. Who had the smoothest skin? Who moved with the most grace? Who pleased the Sultan best? These questions were not innocent, they were daggers driven between the captives. Rewards were given sparingly, a finer robe, a better meal, or even a glance of approval from the Sultan. But for every boy lifted up, dozens were left to stew in bitterness. Rivalries grew sharp as knives. Boys who once shared food began to whisper against each other, hoping to climb higher by pulling others down. Eunuchs encouraged this poison. They whispered lies into trembling ears. He is plotting against you. He wants your place. Suspicion grew, trust died. The Sultan benefited most. By keeping his concubines divided, he ensured none would unite against him. Every jealous glance, every quiet betrayal, only tightened his control. But jealousy inside the harem was deadly. Accusations, true or false, could lead to savage punishments. A single whisper that one boy disobeyed, or even dreamed of escape, could see him dragged away, never to return. And so, jealousy became a silent executioner. It made enemies out of brothers, spies out of slaves, and ensured that the harem devoured itself from within. In the gilded world of Topkapi Palace, obedience was not a request, it was a law written in blood. For the male concubines, every breath, every movement, every word had to reflect submission. But what happened when a boy dared to resist? The answer was simple: punishment. Disobedience took many forms. A boy who refused to dance. One who flinched when touched. Another who whispered of escape. Sometimes, it was nothing more than a glance of hatred in the wrong direction. In the Sultan's harem, even thoughts seemed dangerous. And when disobedience was suspected, the punishment was swift. The eunuchs, men who themselves had been broken, became the instruments of terror. They dragged the trembling boy into hidden chambers, where the walls had heard centuries of screams. The others were forced to watch, a cruel reminder of what awaited them should they ever dare to follow the same path. The punishments were designed not only to wound the body, but to crush the spirit. Some were flogged until their backs split open, blood running like rivers across the marble floors. The whips were soaked in brine, so that every lash burned like fire in an open wound. Others were suspended by their arms for hours, even days, left to dangle until their shoulders nearly tore from their sockets. Food and water were denied, leaving them delirious with thirst. But the most feared punishments were reserved for those who resisted the Sultan himself. For them, pain became ritual. Burning incense was pressed into their skin, leaving deep scars across their chests. Some were locked in iron cages, forced into unnatural positions until their muscles seized and their bones warped. And still worse were the executions. The palace did not always kill with swords. That would have been too merciful. Instead, they chose silence. Some boys were drowned quietly in the Bosphorus, their bodies weighed down with stones. Others were strangled with silk cords, the executioner pulling until the boy's final gasps faded into nothing. But perhaps the cruelest punishment was psychological. Sometimes, the Sultan himself ordered a boy spared, after days of torture. His body broken, his spirit shattered, he was returned to the harem alive. This was no act of mercy. It was a warning. His scars became living reminders to the others. His silence screamed louder than words. For the concubines, punishment was everywhere. It lingered in the clink of chains, the smell of smoke, the muffled cries in the corridors at night. And so, fear became their shadow. Obedience was not born of loyalty, it was born of survival. Because in Topkapi, there was only one truth: to resist was to suffer, and to disobey was to die. Not every male slave remained powerless. Among the Sultan's eunuchs, a dangerous game unfolded, a game of power, secrets, and forbidden desire. The highest-ranking eunuchs, men who had survived the horrors of castration and risen through obedience, wielded influence that reached beyond the harem. They controlled access to the Sultan. They decided who would be favored and who would be forgotten. But with power came corruption. Behind closed doors, these eunuchs often indulged in the very acts they were sworn to guard against. They forced younger concubines into secret encounters, using promises of protection or threats of ruin. What was forbidden for ordinary slaves became privilege for those at the top. Rivalries grew vicious. Blackmail, whispered rumors, and even fabricated accusations destroyed lives overnight. One boy might rise to favor by pleasing the chief eunuch, while another disappeared forever, accused of betrayal he never committed. The palace called it discipline. In truth, it was politics, wrapped in silk and soaked in fear. And so, the games continued. Every smile hid a knife, every promise carried poison. The Sultan's harem was not just a place of pleasure, it was a battlefield where the weapons were secrets, and the victims were always the powerless. Deep within the walls of Topkapi Palace, beyond the grand halls and sunlit courtyards, there were rooms few ever saw. They had no windows, no decoration, no trace of daylight. The slaves called them simply the hidden rooms. These chambers were reserved for the darkest desires of the Sultan and his circle. Here, secrecy was absolute. Heavy doors muffled sound, and torches burned low, casting long shadows across cold stone walls. Once a slave was led inside, the world outside ceased to exist. It was here that the most degrading rituals took place. Groups of boys were forced into humiliating performances, stripped of identity, treated as nothing more than flesh. The eunuchs ensured silence, watching with cold detachment as if recording sins no history would ever admit. Some rooms were designed with cruel detail, chains fixed into the walls, platforms built for spectacle, drains in the floor where blood and water mixed. They were not places of love, nor even of lust. They were laboratories of control, where human dignity was dissected piece by piece. And when the doors finally opened again, the slaves who stumbled out were no longer the same. Some were broken, trembling, unable to speak. Others were carried out lifeless, their bodies vanished by dawn. The hidden rooms of Topkapi were not built for beauty, they were built for silence. And in their silence, they held secrets that history still dares not fully uncover. In the Sultan's palace, control was not enforced only with chains and whips. Sometimes, it came in the form of a cup. The male concubines were often given drinks laced with intoxicants, herbs, opium, and powerful aphrodisiacs imported from distant lands. To the unsuspecting, it seemed like fine wine or sweet sherbet. But once swallowed, it clouded the mind, weakened resistance, and left the body pliant. Some boys laughed uncontrollably, stumbling in confusion. Others fell into a daze, unable to distinguish dream from reality. And in this haze, the eunuchs and their masters forced them into humiliating acts they would never have agreed to awake. The poison was not always physical. Incense burned in the chambers, releasing thick, sweet smoke that dulled the senses and blurred judgment. The air itself became a drug, wrapping the slaves in a fog of submission. But the price was cruel. Many suffered fevers, shaking fits, or violent sickness after these forced intoxications. Some became addicted, their bodies craving the very poisons that enslaved them. For the palace, this was intentional. An addicted slave was easier to control, forever dependent on his master for the substance that dulled his pain. The Sultan's court called it pleasure. For the slaves, it was chains made of smoke and wine. And once the poison took hold, even their own minds were no longer safe. Every sultan left his mark on the empire, but behind closed doors, some left behind stories too scandalous for official records. The obsessions of these rulers shaped the fate of countless male slaves. Some sultans were consumed by beauty. They demanded boys with delicate features, fair skin, or unusual eyes, collecting them like treasures. Others preferred the youngest, believing innocence itself could be broken and remade. There were rulers whose pleasures turned to cruelty. One sultan was rumored to host midnight spectacles, forcing boys to fight or perform in degrading rituals before granting his twisted approval. Another, known for his paranoia, demanded complete submission. Slaves were forced to bow at every glance, their lives hanging on his moods. Perhaps most disturbing were the sultans who blurred the line between desire and punishment. For them, pain itself became part of the pleasure. Whips, fire, and forced humiliations were woven into their nights, leaving scars that outlasted the reigns themselves. The palace chroniclers never wrote these details, but whispers survived, passed through servants, captured in secret diaries of European visitors, echoed in the fearful memories of survivors. To the world, the Sultan was a symbol of power, majesty, and divine rule. But to the boys trapped in his shadow, he was something else entirely, a master whose obsessions could decide life or death with a glance. For the male slaves of the Ottoman Empire, survival was never about strength alone. It was about submission, silence, and sacrifice. Some learned to obey without hesitation, hoping to escape the Sultan's gaze. Others betrayed friends, trading loyalty for a slim chance at mercy. A few found protection in the eunuchs, who sometimes showed rare moments of pity. Others clung to faith, whispering prayers in the darkness of their chambers, waiting for a dawn that often never came. But every choice had a cost. Survival meant surrendering dignity, innocence, even identity. Many forgot their real names, answering only to titles given by their masters. Some never saw freedom, their lives ending in silence, their bodies buried without a marker. And yet, fragments of their suffering survived, in the whispers of travelers, in hidden manuscripts, in the silent architecture of Topkapi's walls. History tried to erase their pain, painting the empire in glory. But behind the splendor was a shadow of unimaginable cruelty. The slaves' price of survival was simple, yet devastating. To live, they had to become less than human. And as we close this story, one truth remains. Behind the golden gates of empire, the brightest crowns often hide the darkest chains.